suddenly I found myself sitting on the floor of the tank. I hadn't heard anything. I didn't know what it was doing. There was my wireless operator looking down at me. And I said to him, "What have you done?" I couldn't think why I was sitting on the floor. He said, "Sir, we've been hit." The moment he said that, I realized that I was very deaf. But luckily, this hit had been on the thickest part of the turret of the tank, and it had not penetrated the tank. Of course, it had wrecked the wirelesses that we had in the tank. Anyway, I told Corporal Sorensen to drive on up to the sand dunes, which he did. And once we got there, I jumped out because I couldn't command my squadron by radio. I had to do it on foot. I was just in time to see the leading tank of one troop tip into this crater, which was huge. As I looked over the sand dunes, it was quite a way in front of the sand dunes. And you could see that it was going in. The driver obviously didn't know how deep the crater was, but it was deep. And the crew had to bail out. Unfortunately, of the 6 of them, all 4, but four were killed. To cut a long story short, what we had to do was to push the first tank, which was 1 Charlie, into the crater. Now, we were being fired at a lot, and I had to get the 1st Hussars of Canada to get their tanks onto the top of the sand dunes to give us some covering fire. Well, we had to push, as I said, 1 Charlie into the middle of this crater where you could just see the top of the turret once it was pushed in. We used another tank to do this. We then dropped an assault bridge onto the top of 1 Charlie. We then put an AVRE over that, and it tipped Fascine beyond that. Then another Fascine, and then at last, the first AVRE got across that and onto the far side, the first tank to leave the beach. We then beckoned forward some of the 1st Hussars tanks because the infantry by then were crossing and they needed to have tank support before they went inland. The 1st Hussars, first tank got over quite well, going very steadily, had a good driver. The 3rd tank over, rather panicked, he tipped over and fell on his side. However, the tank that we had got over first, I told him to be prepared for this, and he had his cable ready to connect up with this tank and tow it off. And then steadily other tanks went over. And there was an enormous German pillbox here. And I said, you better have a look in that pillbox when you go past too. I saw him looking in there and he suddenly doubled out of it with a look of absolute horror on his face. He said, it's full of German. However, the first German came up with his hands up. And then some, I think, 25 more Germans came up, all with their hands up. So we took the prisoner. Walked along the beach to see how 1 troop were getting on. The only problem was mines, but they had no flails, so they were clearing their mines by hand. So I walked into Courseulles. Here, there's a swing bridge, and it was swung in the open position, and I could see it was going to have to be swung shut if anyone's going to get over. I went to have a look at it to see whether it was prepared for demolition, and saw that it was. And I was just looking at that when a shot rang out and hit the ground very close to me. I dived for the nearest doorway, in which there was a Frenchman standing, and he knew which window this shot had come from. Now, by chance, in another doorway, there was a Canadian. I don't know what he was doing there. 1 Canadian soldier. So we got hold of him, and the Frenchman directed him to fire shots from his rifle into this window. He fired about half a dozen shots. He was quite a good shot. We could see the window busting and then bits flying out. Nothing much more seemed to happen, so I thought, well, I'll go and have another look again. So I went out, and the Frenchman came with me, and he showed me how to rotate the big wheel to swing the bridge, so it was in fact crossing the harbour entrance here, and I then pulled the explosive off it and chucked the bits into the river below. I then crossed the bridge and went into Courseulles along here. I was just getting near the beach when I saw somebody darting between 2 houses. So I darted in too, thinking I didn't want to be caught out by a German. But this turned out to be Dickie Bowes coming to see me. So we met there, and he told me that things had gone well. He got 2 assault bridges up against the plage here, and that Canadian tanks and vehicles were streaming southward through Courseulles, which is good news. The bridge that we had put down was removed by the beach group a couple of days later, and a Bailey bridge was put over instead. This stayed in place for, I think, about a year when the French civilian organisation put a civilian bridge over it, much wider than the Bailey bridge. That stayed there until 1976, when 2 6 Squadron decided, as an exercise from Germany, to see if it could drag out 1 Charlie if it was still there. Of course, it was there, and they came down. The crane was provided by the French army, and finally, after a lot of digging and so on, this muddy monster was pulled back up, and they put it just on the sand dunes near where we'd all landed, and there it stands today. That evening, I went to see a doctor on the beach who said, well, I ought to be sent back to England, but the danger is of your ear getting infection when it's been broken. And he put some stuff in to stop that. We had our rendezvous. I had just one final thing to do, and that was to report to brigade headquarters that we finished our task, arranged for a motorcycle to be put on one of the tanks in order to enable me to do this. Anyway, I set off following the signs, and I was passing through a wood where I saw a Frenchman standing by a farm holding a glass and a bottle. Obviously, he was going to offer me a drink, and I felt that's exactly what I need. This was towards the end of D-Day. So I stopped, and he poured out a big slug, and I took a great gulp. Very strong, but marvellous, absolutely magnificent. Best drink of my life. And I reported to brigade headquarters and came back, and by that time, the rest of my crew had prepared a meal, and we bedded down underneath the tank, this thing you're not meant to do, but we thought we might be shelled. And that was the end of D-Day.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to help support the Royal Engineers Museum and visit our website for further details. Our very best to everyone, everywhere.